The story begins with a wealthy and powerful businessman named William Parrish, a man who has spent his entire life building an empire while also trying to remain close to the people he loves. William has reached an age where he has everything most people could dream of: money, influence, a beautiful home, loyal employees, and two daughters. But despite all of this, he knows that something is missing. He has always believed that success means very little if a person cannot appreciate the people around him. His oldest daughter, Allison, is preparing for an important birthday celebration for her father, while his younger daughter, Susan, is more reserved and thoughtful. Susan is a successful young doctor who has a close relationship with her father, although William sometimes worries that she has not yet experienced the kind of love that could truly change her life. One evening, Susan visits a coffee shop and unexpectedly meets a charming young man. The two immediately connect, and their conversation becomes surprisingly personal, despite the fact that they are complete strangers. The young man is intelligent, polite, and unusually interested in Susan's thoughts about love and life. Susan feels an attraction toward him almost immediately, but before they can properly introduce themselves or exchange any meaningful information, they separate. Susan leaves the cafe thinking about the mysterious man and wondering whether she will ever see him again. What she does not know is that this brief encounter is about to become connected to something far more extraordinary than an ordinary romance. Meanwhile, William returns home and begins experiencing strange sensations that he cannot explain. During a quiet moment, he hears an unfamiliar voice speaking to him. William soon realizes that he is not dealing with an ordinary person. A mysterious presence has entered his life, and this presence identifies itself as death. Rather than appearing as a terrifying monster, death takes the form of the young man Susan had met earlier. He explains to William that he has grown tired of observing human beings from a distance, and wants to experience human life for himself. He wants to understand what people feel when they love, fear, laugh, suffer, and eventually lose everything they care about. Death makes William an unusual offer. He will temporarily enter the human world, and William will become his guide. In return, William will accompany Death when the time comes for William to leave his life behind. William is shocked and frightened, but he also understands that there is no escaping the reality being placed in front of him. Death tells him that his time is coming, and William cannot simply negotiate his way out of it. For the first time in his life, the powerful businessman, who has always been able to control situations, discovers something that money and influence cannot defeat. The young man takes the name Joe Black and begins living inside William's home. To everyone else, Joe appears to be a strange but sophisticated guest who has somehow become close to William. William's family does not understand who he really is. Joe behaves like someone who has never experienced ordinary human life before. Simple things that most people take for granted fascinate him. Food, music, television, conversations, physical sensations, and even human emotions become new discoveries. His lack of experience sometimes makes him appear innocent, while at other times his strange behavior makes the people around him uncomfortable. Susan eventually sees Joe again and is stunned. She immediately recognizes him as the man from the coffee shop, but she has no idea how he suddenly became part of her father's life. Joe also recognizes Susan, but his reaction is different because he does not understand the emotional consequences of their previous encounter. Susan begins developing feelings for him, believing that Joe is simply a mysterious and complicated man. She does not know that the person standing in front of her is not the man she met at the cafe at all. William becomes increasingly uncomfortable as he watches Joe interact with Susan. He knows the truth about Joe, and he understands that Susan is falling in love with someone who is not truly human. At the same time, William realizes that Joe is beginning to experience emotions that Death was never supposed to feel. Joe's curiosity about humanity is slowly turning into something much deeper. He starts questioning the purpose of life and why human beings become attached to one another, even though they know that every relationship eventually ends. As William prepares for his birthday celebration, his personal and professional worlds begin colliding. His company is facing important decisions, and one of his most trusted business associates, Drew, becomes increasingly concerned about William's future. Drew believes that William is no longer capable of running the company effectively and begins considering how he can take control. William senses that something is wrong, but he has much bigger concerns now. He knows that his own death is approaching, and he has very little time to understand what Joe intends to do. Joe, meanwhile, becomes fascinated by Susan. He begins spending more time with her and asking questions about her feelings. Susan believes that Joe may finally be the man she has been waiting for, but the situation is becoming increasingly complicated. The more Joe experiences human emotions, the less he behaves like the detached force of nature he originally claimed to be. William soon realizes that Death is not simply observing humanity anymore. Joe is changing. He is developing desires, attachments, jealousy, curiosity, and even love. And that creates a dangerous situation because Susan is becoming emotionally involved with him without knowing the truth. As the birthday celebration approaches, William understands that his final days are no longer going to be about business, wealth, or power. Instead, he must confront the most important question of his entire life. What does it truly mean to live when you know that your time is running out? And while William struggles to accept his own fate, Joe Black is beginning to discover something even more confusing: the value of being alive. Joe Black's presence inside William Parrish's home becomes more complicated as the days pass. William knows that Joe is dead, but the rest of the family still sees him as an unusual and mysterious guest. Joe continues learning about ordinary human life, and almost everything fascinates him. He is discovering sensations that human beings experience every day without thinking about them. He tastes food with genuine curiosity, listens carefully when people speak, and studies the behavior of everyone around him. To William, this is both fascinating and disturbing because he knows that Joe is supposed to be guiding him toward death, not becoming attached to the world he is supposed to leave behind. Susan becomes increasingly interested in Joe because she believes he is the same man she met at the coffee shop. She remembers their brief conversation and the strange connection they shared. Joe does not tell her the truth about what happened to the man she originally met. Instead, he simply allows Susan to believe that he is the same person. Susan notices that Joe seems different from the man she remembers, but she interprets his unusual personality as mystery rather than something supernatural. She is drawn toward him because he seems completely unlike anyone she has ever known. William watches their relationship developing with growing concern. He knows that Susan has fallen for the appearance of a man who is actually Death. He cannot simply explain the truth without sounding insane, and even if he did, there is no guarantee Susan would believe him. William also understands that Joe is beginning to feel something he was never supposed to feel. Death came into William's life intending to experience humanity, but now he seems particularly interested in Susan. Joe begins asking William questions about love. He wants to understand why people become emotionally attached to one another, even though they know relationships can cause pain. William explains that love is not something humans choose simply because it is safe. People fall in love because being connected to another person gives life meaning. Love can create happiness, fear, jealousy, sacrifice, and heartbreak, but those emotions are part of what makes human existence valuable. Joe listens carefully, almost like a student trying to understand a subject he has never encountered before. At the same time, William's business world starts becoming increasingly unstable. His long-time associate, Drew, is secretly planning to take control of the company. Drew believes William has become too sentimental and too old-fashioned to make the decisions necessary to protect the business. Behind William's back, Drew begins manipulating the people around him and preparing to take advantage of the situation. William senses that someone is attempting to undermine him, but he is not interested in fighting the same battles he once would have fought. Knowing that his life is coming to an end has changed his priorities. William's family prepares for his birthday celebration, which is supposed to be a joyful event. The house becomes filled with preparations, guests, decorations, and conversations. Yet William cannot fully enjoy the occasion because he knows something everyone else does not. Death is standing beside him, living under the name Joe Black, and the countdown toward William's final moments has already begun. During this period, Susan and Joe grow closer. Susan tries to understand him, while Joe remains fascinated by every aspect of her personality. She is intelligent, compassionate, and independent, and Joe sees qualities in her that make him increasingly interested in human emotions. Susan believes she is getting to know a mysterious man, but she does not realize that Joe is learning what it means to care for someone for the first time. Joe's behavior also becomes more human. He experiences jealousy when Susan talks about other people. He becomes emotionally affected by conversations and begins showing preferences of his own. These changes concern William because they suggest that Joe may no longer be following the rules he originally described. Death was supposed to remain detached, but Joe is becoming involved in the emotional world of human beings. Susan eventually realizes that she is falling deeply in love with Joe. She remembers the connection she felt with him at the coffee shop and believes their relationship was somehow meant to happen. But there is a painful misunderstanding at the center of her feelings. The man Susan met originally was not the same person now standing in front of her. Joe is using the identity of that man, but his personality and purpose are completely different. William finds himself caught between protecting his daughter and accepting the strange circumstances surrounding his own death. He knows that Joe has the power to take him away at any moment, yet Joe has given him more time because he wants to experience human life first. William begins to understand that his final days may become an opportunity rather than simply a punishment. He can spend his remaining time with his family, repair relationships, and finally appreciate the life he spent so many years building. Meanwhile, Drew's plan against William becomes more serious. He begins pushing forward with his attempt to gain control of the company, believing that William is too distracted to stop him. But William is still capable of seeing what is happening around him. He begins questioning Drew's motives and realizes that the betrayal is coming from someone he once trusted. Joe, however, is far more interested in Susan than in business. He starts experiencing the same emotional confusion that humans deal with every day. He wants to be near Susan, but he does not fully understand why. He wants her attention, yet he cannot explain the feelings developing inside him. For someone who has existed outside human life, these emotions are completely new. Susan eventually confronts Joe about his strange personality and asks him to open up. Joe struggles to explain himself because he cannot tell her that he is Death. Instead, he continues learning through observation and experience. Every moment with Susan brings him closer to understanding the human condition, but it also makes his eventual departure more difficult. William begins realizing that Joe may be changing because of Susan. Death has entered his world expecting to observe human life from the outside, but Susan has given him something he never expected, an emotional reason to care about what happens next. And as William's birthday approaches, the tension between love, death, business, and family grows stronger. William knows his time is almost finished, while Joe is discovering that life may be far more precious than he ever imagined. The closer Joe gets to Susan, the more dangerous the situation becomes, because eventually he will have to choose between simply observing humanity and becoming emotionally connected to it. William Parrish is becoming increasingly aware that his final days are changing everyone around him. Joe Black, the mysterious figure who has entered his life, was supposed to remain an observer, but his growing interest in Susan has made everything far more complicated. William can see that Susan genuinely cares about Joe, even though she has no idea who he really is. She believes she has found the man she met at the coffee shop, while William knows that the truth is much more extraordinary and painful. Joe continues discovering the ordinary pleasures of being human. He becomes fascinated by food, especially peanut butter, because something so simple feels completely new to him. He watches people carefully and tries to understand why they laugh, argue, become jealous, forgive each other, and fall in love. William patiently answers his questions, explaining that human beings rarely understand their own emotions completely. People can know that something will eventually end and still choose to love it anyway. For William, this becomes an important lesson as he prepares for his own death. Susan's feeling for Joe becomes stronger. She spends more time with him and begins to believe that their relationship could become something serious. Joe, meanwhile, is experiencing emotions that are completely unfamiliar to him. He is no longer simply studying Susan as an example of humanity. He genuinely wants to know her. He wants to understand her fears, her dreams, and what makes her happy. The more time he spends with her, the more human he seems to become. But there is another problem developing inside William's company. Drew has been secretly working against him and believes he can use William's upcoming birthday and personal circumstances to seize control of the business. Drew thinks William is becoming weak and distracted, especially because he has started behaving differently since Joe arrived. Drew does not understand the real reason behind William's unusual behavior, but he recognizes an opportunity and begins moving more aggressively. William eventually discovers that Drew has been manipulating the company's affairs. Instead of immediately reacting with anger, William carefully watches him. His perspective has changed because he knows that his time is limited. In the past, he might have fought to protect every part of his empire, but now he is beginning to question whether wealth and power are worth holding on to at the cost of everything else. He wants his final days to have meaning rather than being consumed by another corporate battle. Joel's relationship with Susan creates an even bigger emotional conflict. Susan remembers the stranger from the coffee shop as someone warm and spontaneous. Joe has some of the same appearance and mannerisms, but there is something different about him. He seems innocent in some situations and strangely disconnected in others. Susan cannot explain why, but she feels that Joe is unlike anyone she has ever known. Instead of pushing him away, however, the mystery makes her even more attracted to him. William begins to worry about what will happen when Susan eventually learns the truth. He knows that Joe is deaf, and he also knows that Susan has fallen in love with him. William fears that his daughter will suffer because of a relationship that can never have a normal future. Yet he cannot simply command Joe to stay away from her. Joe has his own growing emotions, and William realizes that even death may not be completely immune to the power of love. During the preparations for William's birthday, the Parrish family becomes increasingly involved in the celebration. Ellison is focused on making the event perfect, while Susan is distracted by her feelings for Joe. William tries to maintain the appearance of normality, but inside he is constantly thinking about the promise he made. At some point, Joe will come for him, and William will have to leave everything behind. Joe begins asking William deeper questions about death itself. He wants to know why humans fear dying so much when death is unavoidable. William explains that people fear death because they have something to lose. They have families, memories, unfinished dreams, and people they love. The fear is not always about death itself. Sometimes it is about leaving behind the life they have built. These conversations slowly change Joe. He begins to understand why human beings value their limited time. For someone who has existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary life, the idea of having only a certain number of years is difficult to understand. Humans complain about aging, but their limited time is exactly what makes every moment precious. Susan and Joe eventually become even closer, and their emotional connection reaches a point where Susan believes she has finally found someone who understands her completely. Joe does not know how to handle the intensity of his feelings. He is used to observing human beings from a distance, not becoming emotionally dependent on one. His growing love for Susan creates a conflict between his original purpose and his new desires. At the same time, William begins noticing that Susan is happier than she has been in a long time. This creates a painful contradiction for him. As a father, he wants his daughter to be happy, but as the only person who knows Joe's true identity, he knows that her happiness could eventually lead to heartbreak. Drew's betrayal also starts moving toward a confrontation. He believes William's attention is divided and that he can manipulate the situation to his advantage. He does not realize that William is beginning to see through him. The powerful businessman who once focused entirely on his company is now more interested in protecting his family and understanding the final chapter of his own life. Joe's transformation becomes impossible to ignore. He is no longer simply fascinated by humanity, he is becoming attached to it. He enjoys Susan's company, appreciates William's guidance, and begins to understand the importance of friendship and family. The emotions he once observed from a distance are now becoming part of his own existence. But the closer Joe gets to becoming human emotionally, the more complicated his relationship with Susan becomes. She does not know that the man she loves is connected to the greatest mystery of human existence, and William knows that eventually the truth will have to surface. As the birthday celebration draws closer, William finds himself standing between two worlds. One is the world he has known his entire life: family, business, love, and human relationships. The other is the mysterious world represented by Joe Black, a world beyond ordinary human understanding. William knows that his time is running out. Joe knows that he is beginning to care, and Susan believes she has finally found love. None of them realize how painful the truth will become once these three lives collide. William Parrish's birthday celebration finally arrives, bringing together his family, friends, business associates, and many of the people who have been part of his successful life. From the outside, everything appears perfect. The mansion is filled with guests, elegant decorations, music, and expensive food. Everyone is there to celebrate William, but William himself is distracted by the knowledge that his life is coming to an end. He tries to enjoy the evening and remain present with his family, yet every moment carries a different meaning, because he knows that he may not have many more celebrations left. Joe Black moves through the party like someone seeing a human celebration for the first time. He observes people talking, drinking, laughing, and pretending that everything is normal. Joe is fascinated by the way people gather together to celebrate another person's existence. He begins to understand that birthdays are not simply about getting older. They are reminders of the time a person has already lived and the memories created along the way. For William, the celebration becomes an emotional reminder of everything he has built and everything he is about to leave behind. Susan remains deeply attracted to Joe. She tries to spend time with him during the celebration, but she notices that his behavior continues to be unusual. Joe does not always understand social situations, and his questions can be strangely direct. Still, Susan sees something genuine in him. She believes that beneath his mysterious personality is someone who is capable of understanding her in a way that others cannot. William watches Susan carefully throughout the evening. He knows she is falling deeper in love with Joe, and this creates a conflict inside him. He wants to protect his daughter, but he also sees that Joe's presence has brought something new into her life. Susan has become more emotionally open, and William realizes that he cannot simply control her choices. For the first time, he must allow his daughter to make decisions without being able to protect her from every possible consequence. Drew, meanwhile, uses the party as an opportunity to continue his plans against William. He believes that William's age and strange behavior make him vulnerable. Drew has been preparing to take greater control of the company, and he is confident that William will not be able to stop him. But William begins confronting him and makes it clear that he knows what Drew has been doing. The situation becomes tense because Drew realizes that William is still completely aware of what is happening inside his company. William refuses to let Drew's betrayal destroy his final days. He has spent decades building his business, but he is now beginning to understand that the company is not the most important thing he will leave behind. His family and the relationships he has created matter far more. William begins thinking about his legacy, not in terms of money or corporate power, but in terms of how people will remember him. Joe's relationship with Susan continues to deepen. He begins experiencing emotions that he cannot control. He becomes protective of her and increasingly concerned about her happiness. These feelings are confusing because Joe has always existed outside the emotional limitations of humanity. He is supposed to guide people toward death, not become attached to one of them. Susan eventually spends a private moment with Joe, and the emotional tension between them becomes stronger. She tells him about her feelings and her uncertainty. Joe listens carefully, but he struggles to respond like an ordinary man, because he does not fully understand how human relationships work. Yet his growing affection for Susan is obvious. He is no longer simply pretending to be human. He is beginning to feel human. William notices this transformation and becomes increasingly concerned. Joe originally promised that William would be his guide through human life, but now William seems to be teaching Joe something far more important: how to care about another person. William explains that love requires vulnerability. When you love someone, you accept the possibility of pain because the connection itself is worth the risk. Joe begins to understand this idea through Susan. He realizes that humans are willing to experience fear and heartbreak simply to feel connected to another person. This discovery makes him question his own role. If he can experience love, then perhaps he is capable of experiencing loss as well. As the night continues, Susan becomes increasingly convinced that Joe is the man she met earlier. She does not understand why he behaves so differently, but she assumes that his mysterious nature is simply part of his personality. She has no reason to suspect that the person she is falling in love with is actually dead. The emotional situation becomes even more complicated because Joe is beginning to experience jealousy and possessiveness. These are emotions he has only observed in humans before. Now he is feeling them himself. He wants Susan's attention and does not want to share her with anyone else. William recognizes these emotions immediately and realizes that Joe's transformation is becoming more serious. As William Parrish's birthday celebration continues, the atmosphere around the mansion becomes increasingly complicated. To everyone else, it is simply a grand celebration for a successful businessman. But William knows that something much bigger is happening beneath the surface. He has accepted that death has come for him, yet he is still trying to understand why death has chosen to experience human life before taking him away. Joe Black, meanwhile, is becoming more emotionally connected to the world than he ever expected. Every day he spends with William and Susan makes human existence seem less like an experiment and more like something he genuinely wants to understand. Susan's relationship with Joe continues to develop, but she still believes he is the same mysterious man she met at the coffee shop. She is unaware that the real man she met had died in an accident, while death has taken his appearance and entered her father's life. This misunderstanding becomes the foundation of Susan's feelings. She thinks Joe is simply a strange and emotionally distant man who has suddenly appeared in her life again. What she does not realize is that Joe is learning about love at the exact same time she is falling in love with him. Joe begins to understand that human love is not simply about attraction. He sees how deeply people can become connected to one another and how much they are willing to sacrifice for someone they care about. Susan's affection makes him question his original purpose. He came to Earth to experience life, but now he wants to experience more than food, music, and physical sensations. He wants to understand what it means to love someone and be loved in return. William notices that Joe is changing rapidly. At first, William treated Joe like an unavoidable force that had temporarily entered his life. Now he begins seeing Joe almost like a student who is learning from him. William teaches him about human behavior, emotions, and relationships. In return, Joe forces William to confront his own feelings about death. Their unusual relationship becomes one of the most important parts of William's final days. William also continues dealing with Drew's betrayal. Drew has become increasingly confident that William is losing his ability to control the company. He believes William's emotional involvement with his family and Joe has made him vulnerable. Drew's ambition has blinded him to the fact that William still understands exactly what is happening around him. William eventually makes it clear that he will not allow Drew to steal the company he spent his entire life building. But William's biggest concern remains Susan. He knows she is becoming emotionally attached to Joe, and he fears the consequences when she eventually discovers the truth. William cannot tell her that Joe is dead without putting her through an unbelievable shock. At the same time, he knows that keeping the truth hidden could make her eventual heartbreak even worse. Joe begins spending more time with Susan, and their conversations become increasingly intimate. Susan talks about her dreams, her fears, and the kind of life she wants. Joel listens carefully because every detail helps him understand what makes humans different from the world he has always known. He is fascinated by Susan's ability to care deeply about others while still trying to protect herself from emotional pain. At one point, Joe begins to experience jealousy when he sees Susan interacting with other people. This surprises even him. He does not understand why he feels threatened by the possibility of losing her attention. William recognizes the emotion immediately and realizes that Joe is becoming attached to Susan in a way that could change everything. Joe's transformation becomes more obvious when he begins to appreciate ordinary human experiences. A simple meal can make him happy, a conversation can make him curious, music can affect his mood, Susan's smile can completely change his behavior. These things are normal for human beings, but for Joe, they represent an entirely new existence. William explains to Joe that the greatest difference between humans and death may be the fact that humans understand their time is limited. Because they know they will eventually lose everything, they learn to value moments that might otherwise seem insignificant. Joe begins to understand that mortality is not only a weakness, it can also be the reason life has meaning. Meanwhile, Susan continues to struggle with her feelings. She knows there is something unusual about Joe, but she cannot stop herself from being drawn toward him. She remembers the instant connection they had at the coffee shop and believes that their meeting was somehow meant to happen. She does not know that the person standing beside her is not the man she originally met. As Susan and Joe become closer, William becomes increasingly uncomfortable. He understands that Joe's presence could change Susan's life forever. Yet he also sees something beautiful in their connection. Joe has spent an eternity observing human beings, but Susan is teaching him what it means to actually care about one. Drew's actions eventually create more pressure inside the company. He wants to force William into decisions that would weaken his position, but William refuses to surrender. He begins preparing for the possibility that he will not be around to manage the company and wants to make sure that his family is protected. His decisions are no longer based on personal ambition. He is thinking about what will happen after he is gone. This makes William's relationship with Joe even more meaningful. Joe is supposed to take William away. But before that happens, William wants Joe to understand that human life is not measured by wealth or status. It is measured by relationships, memories, kindness, and the moments people share with one another. Joe slowly begins to realize that this is exactly what he has been missing. For the first time, Dad begins to understand why humans fight so hard to remain alive. And for the first time, William begins to understand that accepting death does not mean giving up on life. It means appreciating life while it is still there. But Susan's growing love for Joe creates a problem that neither of them can avoid forever. She believes she has found the man she met at the cafe, while Joe is beginning to understand that he has fallen in love with her under a false identity. The closer they become, the more painful the eventual truth will be. William knows it. Joe Black's growing attachment to Susan begins to create an emotional conflict that becomes impossible to ignore. He entered William Parrish's life expecting to observe humanity, but Susan has changed his entire understanding of what it means to be alive. He is no longer satisfied with simply watching human beings experience love, fear, and happiness. He wants to experience those emotions himself, and Susan has become the person who makes him want to remain in the human world. Susan continues believing that Joe is the mysterious man she met at the coffee shop. She remembers their first conversation and the instant connection between them. When Jo appeared again at her father's home, she naturally assumed that fate had brought them back together. She does not know about the accident involving the original man or that death has taken his appearance. Because of this, Susan's feelings are based on a misunderstanding that Joe is unable to correct. Joe, however, is becoming increasingly fascinated by Susan's personality. He asks her questions about relationships, happiness, and what people expect from one another. Susan finds his questions unusual, but she enjoys answering them. She believes Joe is simply inexperienced or emotionally complicated. She does not realize that he is literally trying to understand humanity for the first time. William watches their relationship carefully. He knows that Joe's feelings are becoming genuine, and this makes him nervous. William understands that death is not supposed to fall in love. Death is supposed to remain outside human emotions and simply perform its role. But Joe is beginning to experience the exact emotions that make human beings vulnerable. William tries to explain to Joe that love is not something that can be controlled. It can make a person stronger, but it can also make them afraid. When someone truly loves another person, the possibility of losing them becomes one of the greatest fears they can experience. Joe listens carefully, but he does not fully understand until he begins imagining Susan no longer being part of his life. At the same time, William's business problems continue. Drew's attempt to gain control of the company becomes more aggressive. He believes William is no longer capable of protecting his position, and he begins making moves that could seriously damage William's reputation. William realizes that Drew's betrayal is not simply about business. It represents everything William has spent decades building, and the possibility that his legacy could be destroyed by someone he trusted. William decides that he cannot leave his affairs unfinished. Even though he knows he will soon die, He wants to make sure that his family and company are protected. He begins confronting the people responsible for the problems inside his business. His actions show that accepting death does not mean becoming passive. William is still determined to do what is necessary while he has time. Joe remains largely uninterested in corporate politics. His attention is focused on Susan and on understanding the human world. He becomes fascinated by small details that ordinary people barely notice. He watches couples, families, and strangers interacting with one another and begins recognizing patterns of affection and conflict. He realizes that humans are constantly risking emotional pain simply because they want connection. Susan's feelings for Joe become stronger and she begins imagining a future with him. Joe senses how much she cares about him, but this makes his situation even more difficult. He knows that he cannot remain in the human world forever. Eventually, he must return to his true existence, and William's time is also running out. Joe begins questioning what will happen to Susan after William's death. He understands that Susan will lose her father, but he also knows that she may believe she is losing Joe as well. This realization causes him to experience something new: guilt. He begins understanding that his presence has consequences for other people. William notices the emotional change in Joe and realizes that Joe is becoming more compassionate. The strange visitor, who once seemed completely detached from humanity, is now concerned about the feelings of others. William understands that this may be the most important thing Joe has learned during his time among humans. Meanwhile, Susan starts noticing that Joe's behavior sometimes seems almost childlike. He can be extremely intelligent but strangely unfamiliar with ordinary human customs. He sometimes reacts to simple things with amazement, while other times he speaks with an ancient seriousness that seems completely out of place. Susan finds these contradictions confusing, but they also make Joe more intriguing to her. As their relationship develops, Susan eventually becomes emotionally vulnerable around Joe. She shares more of herself and allows him to see the side of her that she usually hides. Joe realizes that Susan trusts him, and that trust creates a responsibility he never expected to have. William's relationship with his daughters also becomes more important. Knowing that he has limited time, he begins appreciating conversations that once seemed ordinary. He wants to leave his family with memories rather than regrets. His entire perspective on life has changed because Joe has forced him to confront something he spent years avoiding. Joe begins to understand William's point. Human beings know that everything they love can eventually disappear, yet they continue to love anyway. That willingness to accept loss is what gives their emotions such strength. The more Joe learns, the more he becomes emotionally human. He begins to understand humor, affection, jealousy, sadness, and desire. He even starts questioning whether he wants to return to the existence he had before meeting William. But there is one unavoidable problem. Joe is still Death, and Death cannot simply become a normal human being because he has fallen in love. Susan's feelings continue growing while William's final deadline approaches. Drew's betrayal is moving toward a confrontation, and the Parrish family is entering a period that will change their lives forever. As Joe becomes more deeply connected to Susan, the difference between his true identity and the human personality he is developing becomes increasingly difficult to separate. He came into William Parrish's life as Death, completely detached from human emotions. But Susan has awakened feelings he never expected to experience. He begins to understand why humans fear losing the people they love, because for the first time Joe himself is afraid of losing someone. Susan continues to believe that Joe is the mysterious man from the coffee shop. She has no idea that the person she met that night is gone and that death has taken his appearance. Because Joe never corrects her misunderstanding, Susan continues building an emotional relationship with someone she thinks she already knows. Joe feels guilty about the deception, but he is unable to walk away from her. His curiosity has turned into genuine affection, and his affection is turning into love. William notices everything happening between them. He understands that Joe's feelings for Susan are no longer part of an experiment. Joe genuinely wants her to be happy, and this makes William realize that death is beginning to understand the human experience in a way he never expected. William also knows that Susan will eventually have to face the truth, and he fears the pain that truth will cause her. At the same time, Drew's betrayal finally begins coming into the open. His ambition has pushed him to make increasingly dangerous decisions inside the company. He believes William is vulnerable because of his age and because his attention is focused on his family. Drew assumes that once William is gone, he will be able to take control of everything, but William refuses to let his final days be controlled by someone else's greed. William confronts Drew and makes it clear that he understands what has been happening. The confrontation exposes the difference between the two men. Drew sees the company primarily as a source of power and personal success, while William has begun seeing his business as part of a larger legacy. William realizes that wealth means very little if the people around him cannot be trusted. Joe, however, remains focused on Susan. He begins spending more time with her and experiences the happiness that comes from simply being close to another person. He starts understanding why humans create memories together. A conversation, a meal, a walk, or a quiet moment can become important because people know they will not have forever. Susan's emotions become stronger, but she also begins noticing something unusual about Joe. His knowledge seems strange, his behavior can be unpredictable, and sometimes he speaks about life as though he is looking at it from outside. She does not yet understand the reason for these contradictions, but her curiosity grows. Joe asks William about the meaning of love and whether humans can truly love someone without expecting anything in return. William explains that real love often involves sacrifice. People sometimes choose another person's happiness even when it causes them pain. Joe listens carefully because he is beginning to face exactly that kind of choice. The situation becomes even more complicated when Joe realizes that his feelings for Susan could interfere with William's final journey. Joe was supposed to guide William toward death, but now his attachment to Susan makes him question whether he wants to leave the human world at all. For the first time, Death experiences something resembling fear, not fear of dying, but fear of losing the life he has only just discovered. William begins preparing his family for the possibility of his absence without directly telling them the supernatural truth. He spends time with Susan and Allison and tries to make sure they understand how much they mean to him. His behavior becomes more affectionate and reflective. The man who once focused heavily on business now cares more about simple moments with his family. Susan senses this change in her father. She realizes that something is troubling him, but William cannot explain everything. He wants to protect her from the truth, even though he knows that eventually she may have to understand what Joe really is. Joe's transformation continues. He begins behaving more like an ordinary human being, but his supernatural identity remains impossible to erase. He can experience emotions, but he is still connected to death itself. His presence reminds William that no matter how beautiful life becomes, every human story eventually reaches its final moment. Susan and Joe become emotionally closer, and their relationship reaches a point where Susan believes she has finally found the person she wants to be with. Joe also wants to stay with her, but he knows there are boundaries he cannot cross. His existence was never meant to include a human romance. This creates the central emotional conflict of the story. Susan loves Joe because she believes he is a human being she met by chance. Joe loves Susan because she has shown him the beauty of human life. William loves his daughter enough to want to protect her from both of them. Meanwhile, Drew's actions begin threatening the stability of the Parrish family. William must deal with the consequences of Drew's betrayal while also preparing for his final departure. He refuses to let fear dominate his remaining time. Instead, he begins accepting that death is not necessarily the enemy. What matters is whether a person has truly lived before that final moment arrives. Joe starts understanding this lesson as well. He realizes that humans are not valuable because they live forever. They are valuable because they know they cannot. Every smile, every conversation, every relationship has meaning precisely because it will not last forever. Susan has unknowingly become the greatest lesson of Joe's existence. Through her, he has discovered love. Through William, he has discovered acceptance. And through his own growing emotions, he has discovered what it means to be vulnerable. But the truth cannot remain hidden forever. Joe knows that eventually he must reveal who he really is. William knows that his time is nearly over. Susan still believes she is simply falling in love with an unusual man. The three are moving closer toward a final decision that will determine whether Joe remains connected to the human world or returns to the existence he has always known. The situation inside the Parrish household becomes increasingly emotional as William's time begins to run out. Joe has now experienced enough of human life to understand that people do not simply exist. They build relationships, create memories, make sacrifices, and hold on to the people they love even when they know those relationships will eventually end. This realization has completely changed Joe. He is no longer the detached figure who arrives simply to observe humanity. He has become emotionally invested in the people around him, especially Susan. Susan continues spending time with Joe, and her feelings for him become stronger. She believes she has found someone extraordinary, even though she cannot explain why he behaves so differently from other people. Joe's strange questions and unusual reactions no longer frighten her. Instead, she begins accepting them as part of who he is. Joe, however, understands the terrible truth behind their relationship. Susan is falling in love with him while believing that he is an ordinary man, and he knows that eventually she will have to discover the truth. William tries to guide Joe through this difficult situation. He reminds him that human beings have choices, but those choices come with consequences. Joe wants to experience everything that life offers, but William explains that a meaningful life cannot be built entirely around personal desire. Sometimes loving someone means accepting that you cannot keep them. Joe begins to understand that his feelings for Susan may require him to make a sacrifice, rather than simply pursue what he wants. At the same time, William's confrontation with Drew reaches a critical stage. Drew has been working behind William's back and believes he can manipulate the company for his own benefit. But William exposes his betrayal and refuses to allow him to destroy the legacy he has built. The conflict demonstrates how much William has changed. Earlier in his life, business power might have been the most important thing to him. Now he is more concerned with making sure the people he loves are protected. Drew's ambition eventually begins collapsing as the truth about his actions becomes known. William's authority is restored, but the victory does not bring him the satisfaction it might have brought years earlier. He knows that no business success can change the fact that his life is coming to an end. His greatest concern is now making peace with himself and making sure his family will be able to continue without him. Joe, meanwhile, continues discovering ordinary pleasures. He becomes fascinated by music, food, conversations, and the way people express affection. Things that once seemed insignificant now feel meaningful because he understands that humans only have a limited amount of time to experience them. Joe realizes that this limitation is what gives human life its emotional power. Susan's relationship with Joe reaches a point where she is ready to fully trust him. She believes that the man she loves is finally opening his heart to her. Joe struggles with this because he knows that he has not been honest. He is carrying a secret that could completely destroy Susan's understanding of everything that has happened between them. William also becomes increasingly protective of Susan. He knows that she is approaching an emotional moment from which there may be no easy return. Yet he cannot control her feelings. He understands that his daughter must make her own choices, even if those choices eventually cause pain. Joe begins to experience something even more profound than love: empathy. He starts thinking about what his decisions will do to other people. This is a major transformation for someone who has spent eternity observing the end of human lives without personally experiencing their emotions. He now understands that every person he takes away leaves behind someone who feels the loss. This realization changes the way Joe sees his own role. Death is no longer simply a function, it has consequences. Every ending creates an empty space in someone's life. Joe's feelings for Susan therefore become even more complicated. He wants to stay with her, but he knows that he cannot simply abandon his nature. He also knows that Susan deserves to understand the truth. Yet telling her would mean destroying the romantic future she imagines for them. William encourages Joe to think beyond his own desires. If Joe truly cares about Susan, he must consider what will make her life better, rather than simply what will make him happy. Joe begins to understand that love may sometimes mean letting someone go. Meanwhile, William prepares himself emotionally for his final departure. He looks back at his life and recognizes both his achievements and his mistakes. He understands that he cannot change everything that happened, but he can choose how he spends the time that remains. Instead of being consumed by fear, he becomes calmer and more accepting. The relationship between William and Joe also becomes surprisingly warm. Joe may have entered William's life as death, but William has become almost like a teacher and companion to him. Joe has learned from William what it means to be human, while William has learned from Joe how to face mortality. Susan remains unaware of the supernatural reality surrounding her. She simply sees a man she loves and a father whose behavior has become unusually serious. She cannot understand why everyone seems to be hiding something from her. As the final stage of Joe's visit approaches, the emotional pressure becomes unbearable. Joe must eventually decide what he will do with the human experience he has gained. William must accept that his time has arrived. Susan must eventually face the truth about the man she believes she loves. The story now moves toward its most important question. Can death truly experience love without changing the natural order of life? Joe has learned how precious human existence can be. William has learned how to let go. And Susan is about to discover that the man she loves is not who she believed him to be. The final moments of their strange journey are approaching, and every decision they make will carry consequences far beyond what any of them originally expected. The final stage of Joe Black's time among humans begins as William Parrish prepares himself for the inevitable. He has spent his entire life building a successful career and creating a family. But now he understands that none of those achievements can protect him from death. Instead of fighting against what is coming, William becomes more peaceful. He has learned that accepting the end does not mean that his life was meaningless. In many ways, accepting death has finally allowed him to appreciate everything he already had. Joe has also changed dramatically. When he first arrived, he treated human life like something mysterious that needed to be studied. He did not understand why people became attached to one another, or why they were afraid of losing their lives. Now he understands. Through William and Susan, Joe has discovered love, loyalty, sacrifice, jealousy, fear, and compassion. Most importantly, he has discovered that the limited nature of human life is what makes every moment precious. Susan's feelings for Joe are now extremely strong. She believes she has finally found the man from the coffee shop and has allowed herself to become completely vulnerable around him. Joe knows that she loves him, but he also understands that her love is based on an identity that is not completely real. He has been using the appearance of another man, and the longer he stays with Susan, the more painful the deception becomes. Joe eventually understands that he cannot continue pretending forever. He has to make a decision about Susan, and about the human life he has experienced. If he stays, he will be abandoning the role he was created to fulfill. If he leaves, Susan will lose the person she believes she has fallen in love with. Either choice will cause pain. William tries to help Joe understand that love is not about possession. A person cannot truly love someone while only thinking about what they want from that person. Real love requires thinking about the other person's happiness, even when that means accepting personal loss. Joe begins to understand that his feelings for Susan may require him to let her go rather than keep her trapped in a relationship built on deception. Meanwhile, the consequences of Drew's actions finally become clear. His attempt to undermine William has failed, and the truth about his betrayal has been exposed. William has protected his company and his reputation, but these victories no longer matter to him as much as they once did. His attention is focused almost entirely on his family and on the final moments he will spend with them. William spends time with Susan and Allison, appreciating their presence in a way he may not have fully appreciated before. He understands that the greatest part of his legacy is not the company or the fortune he leaves behind. It is the love and memories he has created with the people closest to him. Suzanne senses that something important is happening. Her father seems more emotional and reflective, while Joe continues behaving strangely. She knows that both men are keeping something from her. She cannot understand the reason, but she feels that the truth is approaching. Joe's relationship with Susan reaches its emotional peak. He finally understands how deeply he cares for her. But instead of becoming happier, this realization makes his decision more painful. For the first time in his existence, Death does not want something to end. Joe wants to remain with Susan. He wants to experience more human life. He wants to know what it feels like to have a future. But he also understands that he cannot simply take a human life for himself without consequences. William explains that every life has an ending, and every person must eventually accept it. Joe begins to realize that his role is not to prevent endings, but to ensure that the natural order continues. He can experience humanity, but he cannot completely become human simply because he has fallen in love. Susan eventually gets closer to discovering the truth. She begins realizing that Joe is connected to something far greater than she imagined. The man she thought she knew is not the same person she met at the coffee shop, and the strange behavior she noticed was never an act of ordinary shyness or mystery. Joe's final decision becomes unavoidable. He knows that William's time has arrived and he must fulfill the promise that brought him into the Parrish family in the first place. William is ready. After everything he has experienced, he no longer fears the moment as much as he once did. He understands that he has lived a full life, loved his family, achieved his goals, and experienced enough to live peacefully. Before leaving, William and Joe share a final understanding. Joe has learned from William that being alive is not simply about existing, it is about forming connections and appreciating the time you have. William, meanwhile, has learned from Joe that death does not have to erase the meaning of a person's life. Joe prepares to take William away, but his relationship with Susan creates one final complication. Susan loves Joe, and Joe loves her in his own strange way. Yet, their relationship cannot continue in the form Susan imagined. Joe must choose between remaining trapped by his feelings and allowing Susan to have a future that does not depend on death. His choice ultimately proves how much he has changed. The being who once viewed humans as temporary creatures has developed enough compassion to put someone else's happiness before his own. William's journey is also reaching its conclusion. He no longer needs to fight against the inevitable. He has said what he needed to say, protected what he could protect, and spent his remaining time with the people who matter most. The mansion that once represented wealth and power now feels like something much more personal. It contains memories of William's entire life, but those memories are not about money. They are about his daughters, his family, his friendships, and the people he loved. Joe has finally understood why humans fear death. They fear it because they love life, and they love life because they know it cannot last forever. As the final moments approach, William is ready to leave while Joe prepares to complete his strange journey through the human world. Susan still stands at the center of their emotional conflict, unaware of how much has changed because of her. The story has reached the point where love must overcome possession and acceptance must overcome fear. The final moments of William Parrish's life arrive quietly, without the dramatic chaos that might be expected from such an extraordinary story. After everything he has experienced, William is no longer fighting against the inevitable. He has spent his remaining time reconnecting with his family, confronting betrayal, understanding his own life, and helping Joe discover what it means to be human. When the moment finally comes, William is ready. He understands that death is not something he can defeat, and more importantly, he no longer sees it as something he needs to fear. Joe takes William away from the mansion and into the night. Their journey together has changed both of them. At the beginning, Joe was simply death, an immortal being curious about human life. William was a powerful businessman who had spent decades controlling his world. But after spending time together, their roles became almost reversed. William learned to surrender control and accept his mortality, while Joe learned to appreciate the value of human existence. As William works with Joe, he looks back at the life he has lived. He has made mistakes, experienced success, loved deeply, and raised a family. He understands that no life can be perfect, but a meaningful life is not measured by perfection. It is measured by the relationships and memories that remain after everything else disappears. William is finally able to let go without resentment. Joe then returns to the Parrish estate. Susan is still struggling with everything that has happened. She knows that something about Joe is different, but she does not fully understand the supernatural truth behind his identity. She remembers the man from the coffee shop and the emotional connection she felt with him. Now she is confronted with the realization that the man standing before her is connected to something far beyond ordinary human life. Joe understands that he cannot continue the relationship Susan imagined. He has learned too much about humanity to simply take advantage of her emotions. He knows that Susan deserves a genuine human life, not an existence controlled by death. His love for her therefore becomes a reason to let her go. Joe's final decision shows just how much he has changed. The being who originally came to Earth wanting to experience human pleasures has learned that love is not about taking everything you desire. Sometimes love means sacrificing your own happiness for someone else's future. Susan eventually realizes that the man she is speaking to is not the same person she met at the coffee shop. The truth is painful, but she begins to understand that the extraordinary experience has changed her as well. She has confronted love, loss, and mortality in a way that few people ever could. Joe then makes his final journey away from the world of the Parrish family. Before leaving, he encounters the same young man whose appearance he had taken earlier. The moment creates an important connection to the beginning of the story. Joe had entered the human world using this man's identity, but now the identity can finally return to its original owner. The young man does not understand what has happened. He simply finds himself alive again, confused about how he survived what should have been a fatal accident. Joe watches him and understands that this man can now return to the human world and continue living the life that Joe could never truly have. Susan sees the young man and is initially shocked because he looks exactly like Joe. But there is something different about him. His personality and manner are closer to the person Susan remembers from the coffee shop. Slowly she realizes that this may actually be the man she met before Joe ever entered her life. The experience leaves Susan with a complicated mixture of sadness and hope. She has lost the mysterious Joe Black she came to love, but she has also been given a chance to reconnect with the human being whose appearance Joe borrowed. The young man does not know the full story, but he recognizes Susan. Their conversation brings back the emotional connection they had at the coffee shop. Susan realizes that the strange encounter from earlier may not have been meaningless after all. Perhaps Joe's presence was meant to teach her something about love and loss before allowing her to return to an ordinary human relationship. The story's final message becomes clear through these events. Death is inevitable, but that does not make life meaningless. In fact, the opposite is true. Because life is temporary, every relationship and every moment has value. William learns to accept his ending, while Joe learns why humans fight so hard to live. Joe's journey also reveals that love can transform even something as distant and mysterious as death. He entered the human world without understanding emotions, but he leaves it with a deeper appreciation for compassion and sacrifice. William's death is therefore not presented simply as an ending. It becomes the final stage of a life that was full of experiences, relationships, achievements, mistakes, and love. He leaves behind his family and the legacy he created, but most importantly, he leaves behind people who remember him. Susan also changes because of everything that happens. She learns that love is not always about keeping someone beside you forever. Sometimes a person can enter your life for a short time and still change you permanently. Joe's presence forces her to understand that human beings must continue living even after experiencing loss. The young man who returns to Susan represents a new beginning. Unlike Joe, he is genuinely human. He can grow old, make mistakes, fall in love, and eventually face death himself. Susan now has the opportunity to build a real future with someone who shares the same limitations that make human life meaningful. Joe disappears back into the unknown, taking with him everything he has learned. He has experienced food, music, laughter, jealousy, love, fear, and sadness. More importantly, he has discovered the emotional meaning behind human mortality. The story ends with the understanding that life does not need to last forever to be beautiful. William had everything money could buy, but his greatest treasure was always his family. Suzanne believed she had found an impossible love, but that experience taught her how deeply she could care. And Joe, who began as death itself, discovered that the greatest mystery of human existence is not how people die, but how deeply they are willing to live and love, despite knowing that one day everything must end. In the end, Meet Joe Black becomes a story about accepting mortality, appreciating the present, and understanding that love gives human life its deepest meaning. Death may eventually come for everyone, but the memories, relationships, and emotions created along the way are what make a life worth remembering.